Hey, AP students, we're moving on to a new unit today where we're going to talk about some government involvement and how it affects the macroeconomic graph with our aggregate demand, aggregate supply, short run and long run, and some ways we can draw that and prove our thoughts on a graph. So you'll be on these notes here. They look like this. All right, they say Unit 5 at the top, government influence and macro. And then we'll talk about the Phillips curve in another video. So you're kind of filling in some blanks as we go. You're going to draw some graphs. I'm going to kind of speed through it. Some of it's review. We haven't really drawn the graphs with it together yet, but you'll kind of see as we go. Some of it is some stuff that we've already touched base on. So that's kind of some good news, but we do got to know how to apply these graphs and especially some free response question situations. Okay. So our government, okay, is going to get involved in our free market. Maybe that's kind of an oxymoron. We shouldn't call it a free market because our government does have some influences for a few different reasons, right? There are a few products that people can't make a profit to make. Um, for example, building roads or producing our court system. That's hard for people to make a private profit with those types of things where they only really occur when in emergencies, right? We can't keep track of who uses roads for the most part, so the government provides those things for us. We're going to use a fancy term called infrastructure to refer to some of those things, and obviously education too. You guys that are taking my class are all in a public school, so the government provides taxpayers provide the money for the government to pay for some of those things. All right, so they are going to do some things to potentially, hopefully, increase output, which eventually is going to increase our GDP, which obviously is something that happens at a pretty uh, consistent basis, right? And then we're also going to talk about how it affects how much money you and I can borrow. We're going to refer to that as the crowding out effect. We've mentioned it here and there in some previous videos, but that is where we are headed. Okay, so we're only really going to assume that our long run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. We're going to assume that in most cases. Now, this may not be always true because if you look at some of the things that increase our curve to the right. And if we remember, you remember talking about like our first unit stuff, where like acquisition of more land would increase our production possibilities curve to the right. I guess we could shift it to the left. We're not going to really ask you about that though. Economies become more efficient rather than less efficient on a much more consistent basis than the opposite. So some things that can do it. Okay, we can improve our technology, all right, and access to better resources. And so whether that be professional resources for education, whether that be resources with we could say technology in terms of like reaching deeper ground, finding uses for different minerals, whatever that might be. We can also add to just the general quantity of it, right? Population growth would become more efficient in what we're doing. So, those things, going back to the production possibility stuff, um, are some things that can cause our curve to shift to the right. Now, some things it's going to cause initially is it's going to cause a decrease in the price level, just kind of like an increase in supply, right? It's going to cause our price level to go down. And eventually, if we grow too fast, which is what we don't usually want to do, it's going to get set off by contractionary policy, or I'm sorry, expansionary policies to kind of increase our demand for stuff. Okay, so it can be represented by outward shifts in our production possibilities curve. So some measurements you might see is human capital per worker, like how efficient am I at doing something? What is my ability to do something? Increases in technology, we know that that's going to increase how fast we can produce stuff, and also how much physical capital do I have available to myself? And look at what we kind of talk about our infrastructure, right? How reliable is our electric grid? Does the power go out all the time? Which it really doesn't, right? Not in 2021. And are highways available? How easy is it to travel from place to place? How safe is it to travel from place to place? How quick is it to travel from place to place, that make us more productive to do those certain things. So those are all things that can lead to these shifts. So I have some examples here. Obviously, I just labeled our production possibilities graph as consumer versus capital goods. And then I drew over here what we could draw on our macroeconomic graph to show what's going on. So if we have an improved technology, and we'll just add also like population growth to that as well, whatever those particular things are. And we see this over here that it's going to eventually drop our pricing because we're faster, and eventually we're going to try to increase our GDP. As remember we said we're going to try to increase. We're going to try to impose some expansionary policy. We're going to try to get kind of back to normal over here. Keep in mind too, our short run aggregate supply curve is going to start moving back this way too. Now, I've never seen you have to draw these things. This is a concept. This is how output is increased. What you need to know. This is how output is increased by government involvement, right? Investment in human capital, investment in infrastructure. This is how we can move our output over to the right, which has occurred over time, right? We know that this output increases. We're way more productive than we were in, say, 1900. We're way more productive than we were in the 1970s. And again, like I said, we don't have to draw this as much, but we can represent it if we have to, as we know that the government is doing those things, investing in us, education, infrastructure, those types of things. Now, on the flip side, there also are some things that the government can do that are a little bit more risky in terms of affecting you and I. Okay, so we've talked about when the government has to borrow money, and our particular government is always constantly borrowing money over, $300 billion worth a year in a lot of cases. Remember, they're going to borrow money from the same place you and I borrow money from. So when we have a situation where the government said, let's just say, for example, the COVID situation, right? The government has to pay for a lot of unexpected things. Well, that's going to change their demand for borrowing money. Okay, it's going to increase the overall demand. And again, remember, the government is part of that demand curve because they borrow money just like you and I and businesses do. Well, that's going to raise our interest rates. When that raises our interest rates, remember, interest rates are a determinant factor of aggregate demand. And so whether or not you and I are borrowing the money or businesses are borrowing money, right? Aggregate demand is eventually going to shift back to the left, okay, due to those loanable funds being more expensive than they were before. Again, this is if the government gets to that point that they're borrowing so much money that they raise interest rates and banks run out of money to loan out. Okay, if you're not familiar with the banking system, you need to watch a few more videos. You need to watch some previous videos and make sure you're familiar with how the banking system decides their interest rates, right? They're monitored by the Federal Reserve, and obviously they're trying to sell as much of their money as possible. When there's less of it, they have to raise the price, just like any other good or service. Now, on the flip side, something else can happen too. Okay, and whether you want to explain it as the government's demanding more stuff, or whether or not you want to say that the general public is going to save less money, let me kind of explain it. So remember, we have some options of how to not spend our money, so to speak. So remember, we can save it in a bank, we can put it in the stock market, we can also invest in the government. Well, if we decide that saving it in a bank is not beneficial to us, right? Remember, we represent this supply line too. They can't loan money out that we don't save. So if we say, like, oh, the government, you know what, they're going to offer good interest rates for us to loan them money, which happened during World War II, happened a lot through the 70s and 80s. We could also say that it's going to decrease the supply of loanable funds. Now, they'll always give you one or the other, but we're just justifying what's going to happen in two different ways. So we can also decrease the supply of loanable funds, which the nice thing is our interest rate goes up just like if we were increasing the demand for loanable funds, right? So you can get away with drawing one or the other. That's going to lead over here, again, higher interest rates, same result over here is it's going to decrease our aggregate demand, okay, which again lowers our output, is going to lower price levels obviously a challenging aspect to if our government eventually gets to that point. I've seen this asked in a multiple choice situation where it talks about not necessarily saying, well, the government decides to offer more interest than they did before. What's that do for the supply of loanable funds? I haven't seen it too much. I have seen it maybe here and there, but it is a way that we can explain that if the government decides to, um, you know, increase their interest rates they're going to pay to loan money, we could argue that the supply of loanable funds would go down. Usually, the crowding out effect is going to refer to this aspect of it. The government's going to borrow so much money, it crowds out people. They're not able to borrow that money. So that's what you really need to be familiar with. Higher interest rates, lower output is what you really, really, really need to know. Okay, that's it for this video. We'll see you